So we're going to start off by bringing on some of the other types of vehicles we happen to have here today. Most of these are actually privately owned, and it just so happens we've got quite a nice collection of wartime German motorbikes. First one coming on there is a BMW R75, as is the second, and the third one's a BMW R12. That's if you understand about motorbikes. I don't at all. The fourth and the fifth bike are Zündapps, R5750 they're called. Now the issue about the Germans and their motorcycles, German industry in the 30s, we have this idea with all these very sophisticated looking bits of kit, half tracks, etc., motorcycle combinations like this. Their motor industry was actually way behind France and Britain, much smaller. And one of the points we were making earlier on to various people, in World War II, the Germans actually used more horses than they did in the First World War. So there's a bit of feast and famine going on with the German military, some amazingly sophisticated, well-designed vehicles, as well as the use. 80% of German transport in World War II is actually horse transport. The motorcycle combinations, the Germans were quite clever how they used them. They were used even in the Panzer divisions in 1940, sent ahead, not just for reconnaissance, but for the very sensible reason, if they could get to petrol stations ahead before the owner decides to lock his pumps up or destroy the petrol, they could capture them. And that was one of the issues the Germans were not so good at in the 1940 campaign, in most of World War II. Their logistics system was not as effective as certainly the Western Allies later on. And they overcame that by being much better at almost living off the land. So one of the things these motorcycle combinations did in France in 1940 was scout ahead of the main force, making sure not only that things like bridges could be secured before the enemy could blow them up, but also to capture things like fuel stocks. Now, coming on as well, behind the motorbikes, is the famous German Kettenkrad. Sorry, Kettenkrad. It's the German vehicle that was based on the VW Volkswagen. Now, Kübelwagens were, again, an idea that Hitler has a word with Ferdinand Porsche about the people's car, and he said, how can we make them for military use? And they do this very lightweight bodied vehicle. It's got an air-cooled engine in it, which again, for a military vehicle, when you think about it, is quite sensible, because it means that, again, if it's you haven't got a radiator that might be punctured by a bullet or a bit of shrapnel. Air-cooled engine, very light bodywork. It's got a body pan underneath it, so it can slide over rougher ground. And amazingly, it's not actually four-wheel drive, it's only two-wheel drive. Engines in the back, and it was produced in pretty large numbers, and it was just comes into service in about 1940. This particular one was made in 1945, even though it's done up as an Africa Corps version from earlier in the war. And again, just as a little bit of an indication of, again, this idea of German production, 50,000 Kübelwagens were made, which sounds a lot in wartime use, but then if you compare that to the two vehicles behind, the American Jeeps, 500,000 Jeeps were made in World War II. And of course, these are just indicators of kind of the logistics and the supply issues of World War II. It's also that manufacturing capacity. However good that Kübelwagen was, the Americans were going to make so many more examples of an equivalent, and that's a Jeep. Now the Jeeps originally designed by the Bantam company. The Jeep drawings were pretty much handed over to Ford and Willys company. They ended up taking them forward on behalf of the American government. Bantam ended up just making trailers for most of the Second World War. But that simple design, very functional. Again, as I said, 500,000 of those, and they were used for so many different roles in the Second World War. The Jeep was pretty much used for everything. About a third of the production ended up coming to Commonwealth, Allied forces, some go to the Soviets, and again it was a perfect vehicle for its role at the time, four-wheel drive, and of course they carried on manufacturing after the war. The Tank Museum, we've got a version of the Jeep French Hotchkiss company post-war, so a lot of those around. We've got an advert in the archive, I think it's back in the 70s, where someone imported 500 Jeeps, £500 each, so they've gone up a bit in price, but there we've got two examples there, one with a trailer. Lots and lots of modifications, of course, made to Jeeps, depending on the role it's playing. Now behind that Jeep, there's a half-track, American half-track. This particular one's the M16 version of it. Just before the war begins, the Americans, they get the White Scout car, what they call the M3 White Scout car, four-wheel drive vehicle with four wheels on it, basically put a tracked body on the back of it. And that particular vehicle they then put into production, something called the M3 half-track. They make another version called the M5 that mainly is used for Lend-Lease, made in huge quantities, about 54,000 of those American half-tracks made. This particular one is called the M16 variant, and it's because of that set of four 50 caliber machine guns in the back on something called a Maxim mount, and about 2,500 of these ones, 2,700 of these versions were made. And what you've got there is it's basically used for anti-aircraft work. When they went ashore, the Normandy landings, they realised the Luftwaffe wasn't really that prominent anymore, and so they ended up using the ground attack role. And that very last vehicle, which is probably one of the most important vehicles, the GMC truck there, one of those vehicles, that's what kept the American Army, a lot of the British Army, and a huge amount of the Soviet Russian Red Army going in World War II. Made again in vast quantities, GMC trucks like that. No army, whatever your tanks are, can fight anywhere, do anything, unless it's kept with supplies. So that was some of the soft skins that we just happen to have here on site. Most of those private down, do go and have a look at them closer afterwards, but now we're going to come on to, I imagine, what most of you, I think, have probably come here today for, which is some of these German tanks. Now sadly, you can see the Zündapp sat out the front. The Zündapp was working, doesn't work, was working, doesn't work, was working, doesn't work. So it's out there at the moment looking sorry for itself, but the Zündapp is based on the vehicle that's coming on now, the famous German Panzer III. Now Panzer, as I mentioned earlier, when the Germans start designing a tank, they've already been doing some secret experiments. They've been tying up after the Treaty of Locarno in 1923 with the Russians, Soviet Russia. They sent some engineers out. They've been doing some experiments at a place called Kazan in Russia with what was called a light tractor or gross tractor, heavy tractor, all code words for developing tanks. But when Hitler comes to power, that's when they push the proper tank program. Now this is a Panzer III, this is an L model. It's got a 50mm gun. The first model has a 37mm gun. And what the Germans wanted from the Panzer III was really a tank that was going to act as in Britain we would have called almost like a cruiser tank. It would be supported by another type of tank, the Panzer IV, which had a short-barreled 75mm gun on, so that could fire high explosives, help support these tanks, help the infantry on the attack. This is the type of tank they hoped would exploit the attack. And again, they gave it, first of all, the standard German anti-tank gun, the 37mm. The great thing about the Germans is they built their tanks so that they could be improved on. And this one, again, in the same turret diameter, same turret ring, you've now got the 50mm gun, which comes from the pack gun, the anti-tank gun that was on a trailer. They took the muzzle brake off it, and it ends up going in a tank. Now this particular vehicle, we know it was transported to Naples from Nuremberg by rail, shipped over to North Africa, to Benghazi, and it arrives there on the 18th of July 1942. It was issued to the 8th Panzer Regiment as a replacement tank, and because of German records, we know the 15th Panzer Division, they had about 65 tanks at the beginning of August in 1942, and this was one of them. So it arrived at the front, well, not hunting certain, probably by July of 1942, and at some point it is captured. This is before the Alamein battle. We think it might have been at the Battle of Aram Halfa. And this vehicle is captured and brought back to the UK with a number of other vehicles, brought to the UK and evaluated up at Chertsey. Now the Panzer III, the L model there, it's got, you can see on the front of it, on the front of the gun mantlet, there's a bracket where they were going to add even more armour, and across the front where the driver's visor and the co-driver or the machine gunner's position is, there's an extra bit of armour plate there, which is another feature of the German tanks, which is basically don't carry too much armour with you until it's necessary. If the enemy gets a bigger anti-tank gun, add more armour to the front of your vehicle to help protect it. Now you can see as he drives here, we've recreated basically the tank in the colour scheme it was in when it was first captured, and again, from the point of view of running Panzer IIIs, this is a wonderful example we've had here at the museum. It's been kept in pretty much running order almost since it was captured. It was a bit rough at certain times in its history. You may have remembered it was painted grey if you came here some years ago, but now my Hayton workshop team, they put it back in good order, and they've made it end up looking like, again, pretty much as it was when it was captured. Now the drive sprocket, you can see on the Panzer III, is at the front, engines at the back, transmission takes it through to a gearbox at the front, which you'll see that on the Tiger, and it's those drive wheels that are actually engaging with the track to pull the vehicle along it. The idler wheel at the rear is just keeping that track nice and tense so it doesn't come off, and the smaller road wheels are spreading the weight of the tank. Now I mentioned the Zündapp, which sadly isn't running. Back in 1935, the Manstein argues, the German general argues that maybe we should have some sort of armoured support for the infantry. And what you've got there is that Zündapp. You've got basically, it's a Panzer III hull, but it costs about 2/3 of the price because they don't put a turret on the top. And they were issued to artillery, anti-tank units, and again, Guderian didn't like the idea. He wanted all the tanks for his own Panzer forces, but it became very successful. And the Zündapp was, again, it's a cheap way of making a really effective anti-tank gun. And this particular version we've got here, it's the outside you're looking at, it's very authentic. It's got a modern engine that doesn't quite seem to work at the moment. So, ladies and gentlemen, just parking them up there, give us a second, and for all you photographers, we're going to do a petrol burst behind the vehicle, so watch your ears. So, Tiger 131, ladies and gentlemen, and that particular vehicle, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we're very grateful. Lots of people helped us to restore and help us keep running. And one of the other points that you're turning up here today, we are an independent charity, the Tank Museum, so you, by coming here, buying a ticket, that helps us to be able to maintain and look after these vehicles. So thank you very much for coming along, and in the history, in the past of that vehicle as well. As I mentioned, lots of companies, lots of different people, and of course the Heritage Lottery Fund have helped us to be able to restore and maintain this vehicle to keep it going. At the moment, it's the only real Tiger 131, certainly the only real one running. There's about 6 proper Tiger 131s left in the world. There's a number of them put together from bits at the moment, what they were jokingly called Franken Tigers, bits dug out of different battlefields, matched together, and so I wouldn't be surprised sometime in the future we'll see some other versions of vehicles which will be put together so there can be more German armour running, not less in the future. Now, we'll just have a couple of moments and then we're going to show you some of the other vehicles that were contemporaries of the Tiger. And